what we put together for you is we promised to give you a look at Arizona's clinical trials landscape, is to really look at where are we? So the first thing is to kind of get that baseline. Remember, just as Dr. Slater gave us a look at the baseline of where clinical trials are, so we start, this gives you an idea of the R&D spending in the life science industry. And I'll tell you right now, the majority of that spending is clinical trials. So the biopharmaceutical industry is about 85% of the total number. The other 15% is medical devices, not because they're less important, but because in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the clinical protocols we follow are less complex. 29 pharma members represented $51.2 billion in R&D spending in 2013. When you look at the total R&D spending in the entire United States versus Germany versus France, okay, 29 biopharmaceutical companies last year invested more than the total R&D spending of the entire country of France. That's investment. And again, the majority of it is clinical trials. So in Arizona, when we look at, and this is data that was actually generated by the 2013 Pharma Report, to give you an idea, there were 29,291 clinical trial participants benefiting from clinical trials in the state of Arizona in 2013. Now, for the economists and the legislators and the business development people in the room, that was direct investment into this state of $237 million plus, and an economic impact of in excess of $618 million per year. And we don't fund clinical trials in Arizona at all. I could do a really good economic return on investment. I could start funding some clinical trials in Arizona and I can get a 4 to 10 times return on that economic investment. That's kind of cool. And the life we save might be our own, or our grandchild, or our parent. That would be kind of cool too. So one of the things is we kind of looked, and I've broken the trial data. You saw Matt. Matt has really sophisticated data. I have much smaller data sets. But we looked at where the action is by region. And so if you look at where the clinical trials are, and there's this wonderful couple of different websites that we use. One is Clinical Connection that does and slices and dices the data. And then there's always clinicaltrials.gov that has a whole lot more. But you can kind of see this is where the clinical trials are happening in the state of Arizona. Now you will see as we go from slide to slide, some of these numbers will not match up exactly. And the reason for that is you can have a clinical trial that's going on at multiple hospitals or multiple sites, but it's one clinical trial. Or you can have clinical trials from outside of the state that just might be happening at one hospital. So it can go both ways. Am I getting it right, Dr. Shapiro? She said, yeah. And one of my best teachers. Oh, by the way, any errors are mine, not hers. She's the smart Joan. Here's where the action is by hospital. And this is a combination of data that we got because they sent emails out over a weekend and said, okay, guys, what's your number? Or if I didn't have the number, we then went to clinicaltrials.gov and did some searching that way. Kind of interesting. Mayo Clinic, by the way, as far as number of clinical trials in the whole world, is number 1. But in the state of Arizona, Dignity Health is number 1. And a little bird told me that in the case of Dignity Health, St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center in Phoenix is the number 1 site for clinical trials across the entire Dignity Health network, including California. Pretty cool. So life-changing innovation is happening in our community, at our hospitals. And what we're seeing is that, just as Dr. Slater told us this morning, it is bringing people to Arizona. It's not just helping Arizonans, but it's bringing people to Arizona who want to benefit from this life-changing innovation. And when we talk about funding, which we talked about earlier today, and we talked about, where's the money going to come from to fund this? Well, I can tell you that very often the funding, those philanthropic contributions, come from people who have either benefited from treatments or lost a loved one because the treatment didn't come fast enough. And so while we don't ever want to compound their pain, sometimes when you feel that you're fighting something you can't fight, getting them involved with our patient advocacy groups, and you're going to hear from them after lunch, and talking to each other and working with each other, we can make a tremendous difference if we all focus in this area. So the other thing, and economists love to look at population, and a lot of times we hear, well, Arizona is not as far ahead as other parts of the country. We started late. We have more, we have less. Well, one thing that's pretty constant is we decided to look at population. Economists love population because population is something that we can measure. It's a finite number. So we looked at states that have, and I know Senator Dial's seen a lot of this data before because he helped me look through it and develop it. When we look at states that have 5 million to 7 million people, and Arizona's on the top end of that scale, it's kind of an interesting list. For those of you that are in the back of the room and it's hard to see the legend, I'll give you a little hint. Arizona is the top bar every time as we go through these charts. So based on the 2013 data, this is only biopharmaceuticals, so remember we have that 15%, plus or minus for a medical device, and there will be, when we look at Minnesota, Minnesota's probably underreported because they're very heavy in medical device in Minnesota with companies like Medtronic there. But as we look at these numbers, how do we measure up? And it's kind of interesting as you start to look at the number of trials for a state that's been a little slower getting started. We're right there, towards the front of the pack. With states with the same amount of population. And again, remember, this is just biopharmaceuticals. This is not including medical device. But it's interesting data. Now, again, this is the number of trials. Remember, those trials can go from, 1 or 2 people in an isolated trial to a mega trial like MATS. So let's look at patients. Now you start to see some really interesting correlations between the number of clinical trials and the number of patients. The one that really surprised me was Tennessee. Look at the size of the patient base that's being supported in Tennessee. That's a real opportunity for us to figure out what they're doing that we're not, so we can figure out how we can benefit from that. So when we look at, again, we're looking at 2013 data, there was $25 billion across the United States in economic activity that spread across all of the states in the District of Columbia. And if you look at the color code, the deeper the purple, the higher the concentration. So we actually are in the second tier, just as we're in the second tier right now in number of firms in Arizona, as far as our clinical trial space. We are doing great, but we can do more. And that takes funding, that takes collaboration, which Jack Jewett, that's our strong point, right? And it takes a willingness for all of us, not just sick people, but healthy people, to participate in trials. Because as I've been researching this, what the industry leaders, and by the way, those sponsors fund those trials, what they've told us is when you have an engaged, highly qualified population that meets the specifications of our trials, you get more trials. Now, I would be willing to bet that there's not a whole lot of difference in the quality of the population between Tennessee and Arizona. So we've got an area that we can improve. So again, we talked about economic impact. Economists look at money. And the reality is if we're going to develop these programs, and yes, we're talking about life-saving innovation, life-changing innovation, but the reality is if there's no money, it doesn't happen. And so the way that we can look at this, and the way that we should look at this, is we've got national data sets that show that when we increase the focus on clinical trials, we not only benefit a larger potential patient population, but we also have an economic stimulus. We could have, if we, we're not Massachusetts, okay? Don't expect us to hit Massachusetts numbers anywhere soon. But as I look across this thing, and I look at Tennessee, and we're at 618, and Tennessee was at 705, I think $100 million in economic impact would be a reasonable thing to shoot for in the next few years. And I think that's a great opportunity where business and science and our legislature can work together to not just stimulate our economy, but to help our people too. Because at the end of the day, that's what government's for, is to support and help the people. That's why they elect you. So there are ways we can do that. We just have to figure it out. And we figure it out when we work together. So when we talk about how do we expand things, there are a couple of different ways that we can do it. And so what I did is I pulled out just a couple of them so that we can all get on the same page, just like Dr. Slater helped us do this morning. So one is the one that most of us know about, which is the state-based right to try. So from state to state to state, we've seen these laws move across the country. In Arizona, we put it on the ballot. 78% of the voters voted for it. The problem was it sent a very strong message that we want to help people in this way, but there was nothing in that law that enabled it to actually help people because there were too many areas where it conflicted with either federal law or the existing process. So that we told everybody we wanted it, but we didn't tell anybody how we could actually do it. So while we've gotten a lot of noise around those laws at this point, they haven't helped anybody. Not one person in the whole country at this point, and it's been over a year since the law first passed in Colorado. Not one person. So how do we help? Because we all want to help. We just voted to show we want to help. How do we do that? So interestingly, there are a number of things going on at the FDA that have been in the works for quite some time and in Congress to try and move things forward, okay? So we're starting to see some movement in that area that will hopefully help. One of the big complaints has been, has anybody ever tried to, other than the practicing physicians, tried to get somebody into a clinical trial? Show of hands. Okay. The forms that doctors have to fill out, the estimated, and they require this as part of the forms process, you have to estimate how many hours. The current forms, it's an estimated 100 hours to fill out the form to get an extended access, so outside of the clinical trial for a particular patient. What's being proposed right now is a new form that will take 75 minutes. So 100 hours, 75 minutes. That's real progress. That actually opened for comments in February. The comments closed on the 13th. Now the FDA has to go through the whole analysis process, and then hopefully we'll see a final form before the end of the year. So that's real progress. That will absolutely help patients. That's cool. You've heard me talk about 21st century cures. 21st century cures is an effort in the House of Representatives, specifically in the Commerce and Energy Committee, which is what governs 80% of the whole healthcare process, to do it better, to get those cures faster, to help people better, to take cost out of the process. Because the logic is, if we don't make it cost so much to develop the drugs, maybe it won't cost so much to deliver the drugs, right? So there's got to be that balance there. And so we are now starting to see bills come out through 21st century cures, including fast-track bills to try and bring medical devices to breakthrough designation the same way we have with drugs, which has benefited companies right here in Arizona, right? So how do you get a drug to market through the process in 5 years versus 15 years? You fast track it. Well, we've been able to fast track drugs for a number of years. We can't fast track medical devices. We will be able to fast track medical devices, hopefully before the end of the year. So where are our opportunities? Well, here's a couple of interesting things to look at. And we're going to watch a little movie in just a second, but 1% of all, remember I said, if you've got the right clinical trials population, clinical trials will be attracted to your state because they need that population. 1% of all clinical trials across the United States was Hispanics. Interestingly, 1.9 million Arizonans, approximately 30% of our entire population, are Hispanics. I think I see an opportunity for clinical trials. Because if we can engage that community, and if we can appropriately let the sponsors know that we have very highly qualified hospitals and clinical research sites that have an open and willing population, we'll attract more trials. The other thing, and I was so glad to see, that there's hope for me in clinical trials since Dr. Huntelman's actually taken people at 85, which means that I have 30 more years to go while I can participate. But there's been a lot of things written about the fact that most clinical trials end at 65. That's kind of the age range that we look at. But most of us, if we're going to have a major medical issue, it's going to happen after we're 65. And our bodies change. So there's tremendous opportunity to continue to look on that silver area as we continue to look at these studies, and there's a lot of discussion around that. Now, Arizona's population of age over 65 is 13.8%. Anybody have a clue on what the national average is? 13. So for everybody that talks about how so much of Arizona is old people, I got news for you. We're right around, plus or minus, we're right around the national average. But it's still a tremendous opportunity to reach out and educate those communities and those populations that are underrepresented where we have populations that might be interested.
Every day, researchers are developing solutions to these and other health issues through clinical trials. But they're missing something. You. clinical trials offer hope and the promise of innovative new treatments. Without people who volunteer to participate in clinical trials, this would not be possible. It's not enough to wait for someone else to act. We all have a role to play. We all have a responsibility to each other and future generations. That's why I'm in.
So what you see there is part of a campaign that's being run by pharma, the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, and others to really start to spread the word that if we're going to escalate the pace of life-saving innovation, we all have to participate, we all have to be in some way. Whether it's, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, or wacky postmenopausal females, don't know any of those, or multiple different groups. We need to figure out how we can reach out so that we can get the data, not just from sick people, but from healthy people, because they create the baseline too. So, as we move forward, and as we go into the afternoon, think about what you can do. Think about what we can do. Think about what time between today and tomorrow you can carve out 10%, 10 minutes to do the mind crowd test. Think about how you can be in. And join us in helping to shape the future.